You're listening to the Decidedly podcast with Sanger Smith and Sean Smith. Our mission is to help business owners like you defeat bad decision-making so you can improve your health, wealth, and relationships. We do this by digging deep into the stories and expertise of our guests and distilling their knowledge into actionable wisdom for you to carry into your life and business. If you're new to the show, welcome. Be sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. If you prefer to watch this week's episode, head on over to YouTube for the full video. Now, let's get into this week's episode and defeat bad decision-making in your life and business.
Have there been times when you were sort of forced to be vulnerable and maybe you didn't want to or it was uncomfortable?
Oh, most social settings.
Really?
I mean, a time when I was forced to be vulnerable. I don't like sharing my personal life in general at all.
No, I know that about you.
And I'm comfortable with sharing other things. But you know what was crazy? Even just the other day when we were at the board meeting and I was like, well, Sanger has some big news to share. And I know the news is like, I got engaged.
Yeah.
I proposed to my girlfriend. I'm excited about it. Obviously.
I saw you shrink, even though that's a totally positive news. You're very excited about it. I saw you shrink physically because you don't like the spotlight.
I don't want to talk about my life to these people that don't know.
Yeah.
Why does Jimmy care whether I'm in love? Like, I don't care.
It's funny that you do a weekly podcast and you don't like attention.
I don't have to look anybody in the eyes right now.
That's true.
Can I talk about this ring that you're wearing? This thing's sick.
Yes.
Look at the,
all right. There it is.
I don't know if anybody's going to look at this in the camera, but this ring, it says American Express with a big diamond in the middle. Blue American Express diamond. I know the story of this ring.
Yeah.
Yeah. That you were working, you were an American Express financial advisor.
Yeah.
Back when they had that.
Right.
They don't anymore.
There was a period of time where American Express owned a financial advisory firm. And so as a member of that, I had done very well for a number of years in that organization.
Enough to get a big old
and they
gold
gave me this
ring.
big fat diamond ring.
It looks like a Super Bowl ring.
Oh, it does. It's ridiculous. And I'm going to a conference, and so that's
why you're wearing it.
That's why I'm wearing it.
I was like, I haven't seen that in 15 years.
No,
why are you wearing it?
But I'm going to this conference, and so I'm like,
that's such a gangster move to wear that at that conference, because half the people at that conference weren't even at this company when that existed, because that was sold 20 years ago, right?
Yeah, they sold it in like 05. Yeah, so almost 3. And so the funny thing is, it says American Express on it, right? Uh-huh. And so with this group I'm in, we had one of our vendors came in, and the vendor was American Express. And they were talking about how to use points and how to charge card, how they did lending, and all these types of card related things. And so I wore the ring the next meeting, and I said, I charge a lot of my American Express card. So much so they gave me a ring. Everybody they were like, are you kidding me? How much do you spend?
I want the ring, man.
Yeah, they did. They wanted.
It's so funny. Introduce a little exclusivity and people will do anything.
Right.
There was somebody that was about to go into debt to get that stupid ring.
Yeah, there were people.
Well, speaking of vulnerability, like you asked me about, our guest today is he's got a lot to say on vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I am so excited to talk with Jacob Morgan. He is a trained futurist and one of the world's leading authorities on leadership, the future of work, and employee engagement. This episode, you're going to learn a lot, right? You, a business owner, you want to have people working for you who love their job, who are engaged in the work that they're doing, find meaning in it, and do it well. Well, then you definitely need to listen to Jacob Morgan. He's the author of Leading with Vulnerability. It's a great book. We talk about a lot of the concepts in that book. He shared some very, very practical wisdom with us that I know I'm going to implement immediately in my company. So stick around. You're going to learn a lot from this conversation. I'm Sanger Smith with my dad, Sean Smith, and this is Decidedly. Jacob, I'm excited to meet you. I'm reading your story. I'm so thoughtful about vulnerability in my day-to-day life. Reading your story, I'm like, I got to ask this guy, what was your early childhood like? Because that had to be a moment of huge vulnerability. Coming here from Georgia, I felt like an outsider, and I'm from Texas.
Yeah. Oh man, my childhood. Well, first, I think it's really cool that you have a show with your dad. I can't imagine having a podcast with my dad. I think that would be very weird, very awkward, and it would probably be like 2 to 3 minute episodes, and that's, then they'd be over. With my dad probably being like, "We're done here. I'm no more questions." Childhood, wow. Well, my dad worked probably 50, 60-hour weeks. So he would be up in the morning. I probably wouldn't even see him most mornings. And then I would maybe see him a little bit each evening for maybe like 30, 45 minutes. So my mom was doing most of, I would say, the rearing of the kids. I mean, she also had a full-time job, but she got off work a little bit earlier and her office was closer. My dad usually had like a 1 to 2 hour commute to work and back from work. So he'd be up at 5 a.m. He would get off at work probably around 5 o'clock, wouldn't be home until around 7, maybe 7:30. Maybe if we're lucky, we would have dinner together and then play a board game or something like that. And then that would be it. So, my childhood, I don't look back on it thinking anything like bad about my childhood. My dad would try to go to a lot of the sporting events. I played soccer, so he would try to go to the soccer games when he could. Obviously, he wasn't able to make a lot of stuff. But there was no internet. There was no smartphones. It was a lot of being outside, playing street hockey, literally in the street with a bunch of my neighbors who are all young kids like me. And so I actually look back at my childhood thinking I had a great time. I enjoyed a lot of the things that we did. So I don't really have any complaints about it. My dad worked like a dog. He actually just retired 2 weeks ago at 73 years old after working for the majority of his life. But it was a childhood where I was always taught to work hard. It was a childhood, I would say, that was pretty strict. I wasn't given a lot of leeway to kind of goof off and to do whatever I want. So it probably, as you would expect, coming from a Georgian immigrant, former USSR household.
Yeah, that seems to be the story of the immigrant families, especially from Soviet countries. Hey, we're gonna be a family that works hard. We're not slacking off.
No, and there was no, I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on this show, but there was no BS, right?
You definitely can.
There was no talking back. Okay, yeah, there was, no bullshit tolerated by my parents. There wasn't a lot of talking back. Yeah. There wasn't like disrespecting anybody or you get, smacked.
Yeah.
So I definitely got a couple smacks here and there. Nothing too crazy that I'm sure a lot of people have experienced, especially coming from the USSR or coming from immigrant parents or people who are just my age. But it was strict. There wasn't a lot of this stuff that we see in the world today of like, there was no microaggressions. There was no coddling. There was no the kind of entitlement. I didn't have that opportunity or that luxury in my household. It just was not tolerated at all.
How did you move from there, getting into sort of your working life that got you interested in employee engagement and leadership and those types of things? Well,
I really just had a lot of bad jobs working for other people. In fact, I was just at a conference a couple of days ago, and one of the ladies who was at that conference was also one of the employees at one of the first jobs I ever had. And so one of these first jobs I ever had out of college. So I double majored in economics and psychology. I graduated with honors, so I had really good grades. And I thought that I would get a job doing some really cool stuff because that's why I worked so hard in school. And I was promised that when I got to a company in LA, and I had an hour and a half commute to and from work, very similar to what my dad had. And I took this job because I was told I'd be doing cool things and meeting with executives and entrepreneurs and traveling across the country and really making an impact. A couple months into my job, I'm just doing data entry and cold calling and PowerPoint presentations. And finally this executive comes out of his office and he's like, hey, go get me a cup of coffee. Here's $10. And at that point I said, well, this sucks. This is clearly not why I went to college. So I ended up quitting, and I learned about things like affiliate marketing and search engine optimization, building a business and working for yourself and entrepreneurship. And I had one more full-time job after that in the Bay Area. So I threw my clothes in the car, drove up to the Bay Area, lived with my friend and his parents for a couple months. We both looked for jobs. I ended up working for a marketing company there, also terrible job. And then after that, went full-time off on my own. So this lady that I saw a couple of days ago at this conference, we were reminiscing. She's like, oh my God, I heard your coffee story. Yeah, those people were crazy. It was such a terrible company to work for. And we were just kind of looking back on all of our fun experiences from 16, 17 years ago.
That's fun. I don't think anybody's like San Francisco origin story involves anything other than sleeping on somebody else's sofa for free. Yep. You had to grind it out. When it comes to that's obviously such a great bad example of negative employee engagement. The opposite of what I want. I don't want to hire somebody, sell them this dream, and then have them end up feeling like they're wasting their time and their potential. Why do you think that happens? Because you're not the first person to get hired thinking you were going to do something really exciting and then find out that you're, a paper pusher. It happens, and it seems like such an obvious and easy mistake to avoid, but companies keep doing it.
Yeah, it happens a lot. I think a lot of organizations are getting better about it, but ultimately it's, the bait and switch. We tell employees one story, and then when they start working there, we tell them another story. And it's partly because it's really hard to attract and retain talent. So we want to paint this wonderful, rosy picture of what it's like to work at our companies. No company is going to be brutally honest about what it's like to work there. No company is going to say, hey, if you your leaders are going to take credit for your work. You're going to be working in a cubicle. If you work from home one day, you're going to be viewed as being lazy and dumb and not competent. And we don't say that. You're supposed to work 32 hours, but really you're going to work like 40 or 50. Nobody's going to be that honest. We paint this rosy picture because we want people to sign on the dotted line to start working there. And once they start working there, we have them. Then we can do whatever the hell we want. And that's usually what happens in a lot of organizations. And it's not that they're bad people, but we get stuck in the bureaucracy. We get stuck in the office politics. We get stuck in our outdated ways of working. And we've built this big beast of our organizations where we're not good at just challenging the way things used to get done. And we all just get stuck in it. We literally just become these types of cogs. But I think a lot of organizations are getting better now.
We tried to be honest once. You remember that?
Well, that's a rough statement.
No, we were all maybe too honest about what the work requirements were with a candidate. We had spent a lot of time recruiting this woman, and we tried to really tell her like this is what the career. You remember who I'm talking about? We met with her and her husband.
Oh yeah, right.
And ultimately, like I tried to not pull any punches and be like, yeah, it's probably gonna suck for a couple of years. Like you're gonna work hard.
Yeah,
and. She bailed like last minute. She was like, actually, never mind.
It's helpful because that's the place you want to find that out. And I learned that, we took that approach. I was with a company that took that approach. So rather than paint this rosy picture of what it was going to look like, they did the opposite. And they said, it's going to be difficult. You may not make a lot of money early on. You're going to work late. And what they found was taking that approach of being very transparent with the difficulties of early on employment in that industry, was that it hurt the ability to recruit numbers, but it helped retention once those people agreed to it. You still have to paint the picture of like why you're going through the pain. You have to sort of paint this vision of the castle on the hill, but you've got to explain to them that they've got to get through the moat to get there. I remember this was just recently. There was a guy. He was actually an immigrant from Iran, and I had interviewed this guy. And one of my comments to him, and this was literally 30 years ago, and he's still with the company, and he actually just shared this with me recently. I said, when you start, you're going to have to work very hard. And so this guy sees me recently, and he's a good friend of mine now. And he goes, Sean, I want to tell you, you spoke to me, years ago, and you tell me you have to work very hard. And what he was explaining to me is he thought I meant for him as an immigrant with his language barrier, that it was going to be hard on him. And so he goes, that actually helped me because I work very hard. But then I realized you tell me everyone has to work hard. And so it was actually rewarding. So that worked out. So that being transparent worked out.
Yeah. I mean, if you go work for Elon Musk, you go work at Tesla, you go work on Netflix, they don't bullshit you. They'll tell you, they'll say, hey, you know what? We'll pay you well. You're going to be working on some really, really cool stuff, but you're going to be working hard. Don't expect to just be here for, 30, 40 hours. Like, you're going to be putting in some time. But, if you're interested, you're willing to make those sacrifices, you're willing to get paid well, you're willing to get equity in the company, you're willing to work for some of the world's top leaders and learn new things and tackle complex challenges and problems, then this is a good place for you.
I think if you're doing anything great, it's going to be difficult. How do you balance that with creating a positive employee experience, but still have this transparency of saying it's going to be difficult?
Well, just because you have to work hard doesn't mean you're going to have a bad employee experience. You could still be brutally honest with people about what it's like to work there, but also tell them, hey, we're going to coach you and mentor you. We're going to give you the resources that you need to grow and advance. We're going to give you those opportunities to learn new things. We're going to give you stretch goals and stretch assignments, and you're going to be treated with a lot of respect, and you'll have great tools and technologies to do your work. But at the same time, we're not an organization that's going to tolerate backstabbing employees, coming into work and complaining. We're not a corporate culture where you show up to work and you just point out problems and don't come up with solutions. So I think being honest and upfront, there's nothing wrong with that. But, you're not just saying, hey, it sucks to work here. Do you want a job? No, you're not doing that either. You're saying, look, this is what the environment here is actually like. And so you can still create a great experience by treating people well and treating them respectfully and paying them well and taking care of them and looking after them. But at the same time, acknowledging that there are some things that your organization is not going to stand for. I mean, look at what happened with Google when these 28 employees went to the CEO's office and tried to protest what's going on with Israel and Palestine. And the CEO was basically like, yeah, get the hell out. We're not going to be tolerating that here. So at a certain point, you as a leader, and I think this is a huge problem that we're having now. We don't have any strong leaders in corporations. We have very few of them. Every leader out there is scared. They're scared to take a stance. They're scared to upset people. They're scared to talk about what's acceptable and what's not. I mean, can you imagine any of this stuff happening when Steve Ballmer or Jack Welch or any of these other leaders were leading their companies? They wouldn't put up with any of this crap. But today we have so over-indexed on feelings and emotions and let's take care of you. And you could say anything and everything that you want here. And this is a safe place that we're taking advantage of it. There was actually a article that was published by a professor at Wharton recently who said that we're actually creating too much psychological safety at work, where we're saying there's no such thing as a bad idea, where, you can come to work and say and do whatever you want. There's not going to be any repercussions. And that's completely insane. I think we've gone too much in that direction of creating this environment where it's almost like Pinocchio's Island. There's a book that Abigail Schreier put out called Bad Therapy, where she says that one of the reasons over the past few decades why a lot of our kids have been struggling is because we've outsourced a lot of our parenting to mental health providers, where we're very quick to put our kids on any kind of a prescription drug. We're very quick to diagnose our children with something. And so we're seeing the same thing happen inside of our organizations, where companies are coddling their employees. We're assuming that it's the company's responsibility all the time to take care of your well-being, to take care of your engagement, to give you financial training, to give you meditation programs, to give you free food. Where's the responsibility for the employee? How come we're not talking about what the employee is supposed to do to look after themselves? Why isn't the employee responsible for their well-being? What are they doing outside the office, outside work hours, right? Are they eating healthy? Are they exercising? Are they making time for social activities? Or are they just sitting there on Netflix, not doing anything, not going outside, then showing up to work and saying, oh, I'm so disengaged at work, fix me. That's also not healthy. So there's too much emphasis being put on what the organization is supposed to do for employees to take care of them, and not enough emphasis on what employees are supposed to do to actually step up and take care of themselves. And I think this is a huge, huge issue in a lot of organizations around the world. And it's coming from the way that we're raising kids. It's now translating into our organizations.
Yeah, it seems like this cultural shift originated as a response to maybe a corporate culture that lacked any empathy at all. Maybe it was too far in the extreme in the other direction. But what I'm hearing you saying is that this overcorrection we're experiencing is not only creating a negative outcome for the company, because it's creating over-reliant employees who want their employer to meet their emotional needs, not just their financial needs or their work fulfillment needs, but they want them to meet needs in all areas of life. It's bad for that company that has those employees, but it's bad for the individuals, because if the individuals are reliant upon their employer to provide them with emotional support, not only is that a distraction from their work productivity, it's secondly, it's causing them to seek something out of an employer that they ought to be seeking out of more meaningful relationships with their spouse or their family or their friends or their children. And then third is they're seeking something in an area where they're always going to be disappointed. Even the most committed employer who is trying to be super empathetic and coddle their employees, to use your language, like they're always going to fail at that, because that's not the primary or even, secondary function of that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, you look at some of the recent numbers that came out where employee engagement is at an 11-year low. I think half of employees are still actively looking for a new job, even though they have a full-time job, that they're open to going to work for another company. So all your well-being programs, all your health and wellness, all your engagement programs, all that sort of stuff that you're investing in, employee engagement is still at an all-time low. Your employees are still looking for jobs elsewhere. And that just goes to show that you can't, and I'm not saying that these programs are all necessarily inherently bad and that you shouldn't treat your people well, but we've just gone so overboard that it's not sustainable. I talked to one chief human resource officer at a 7,000 person company, and she gave me a great analogy. She said, over the past few years post-pandemic, we created an environment, we created a corporate culture for children where employees were getting raises regardless of performance. They were getting $1,500 credit for this, $1,500 credit for that. They would get free food. They would get anything and everything that they wanted, to the point where the company actually started losing money and it started hurting the business financially. And she said, we're now at a transition period where we're creating a culture, not for children, but we're creating a culture for adults. And we've pulled back on some of those programs, and we recognized and understood, and we told our employees, look, you're here to do a job, okay? There are certain things that we'll help you with as far as learning and training and advancement opportunities and, things of that nature. There are certain things we're certainly going to do for you. But don't expect to show up to work thinking that performance doesn't matter, that competence doesn't matter, and that you're just going to be living on Pinocchio's island, doing and saying anything that you want. And I think and I was actually at another event. I spoke at a big conference a few days ago, and I was in a room with a couple, I think there was 5 or 6 different leaders of various organizations in there. And we were all talking about this, and they all agreed. And these are organizations with hundreds of thousands of employees. And they're telling me they're seeing this exact same thing, to the point where a lot of employees don't even want to become leaders. They just want to take. I want more perks, more benefits, more salary, more equity. And by the way, I don't even want to come to the office. And by the way, don't even ask me to do more work than is required. Don't ask me to make any sacrifices.
Right.
Not sustainable.
Do you? There's a scene in Mad Men.
Somebody brought up that exact thing at this event a couple of days ago. Yeah. I wonder if it's the same scene you're going to say.
Okay. So the scene was that, all right, so Don Draper's talking to his assistant. He says, hey, I give you money. I pay you to come up with good ideas. And she goes, yeah, but when I do come up with the good ideas, you don't even say thank you. And he says, that's what the money is for. Right. So how do we balance and create proportionality between that extreme? Yeah, that's the one. How do we strike the right balance between this Mad Men environment and this coddling environment? There's got to be a set of principles that we want to follow to say these are the things that minimally are expected, needed, and are beneficial.
Yeah, it's so funny that you brought up that exact scene. I've never seen the show, so I feel like I need to watch the clip. I'm gonna try to find it on YouTube as soon as we're done with this, because you're the second person who's brought this up, and I definitely need to check this out. There needs to be a balance for sure. And again, I think organizations, part of it is they need, and by the way, when I interview a lot of these executives, these chief human resource officers, I ask them about the ROI of this stuff. Are you able to go and directly prove why, the dollars and cents behind it? And almost all of them say no, right? They just say, we have the support of leaders. We know why it's important to create a place where people can show up to work every day and this and that, but they're not actually able to prove anything on the bottom line. Now, I'm a big believer, like I shared just general averages. I'm a big believer in companies should look at their own data. They should look at their own policies. They should look at their own practices. And when you're making a decision on what you should offer to people, what you should not, if you have data that supports that, hey, it's improving retention, it's improving engagement, it's making our employees more productive, by all means, do whatever you need to do. If you're actually seeing the benefit in terms of the impact that it's having to your business, right? Go for it. I think the big challenge that we're seeing now is that, there's a concept in psychology called the hedonic treadmill, which basically states that as human beings, we're good at adapting to stuff. And so if you show up to work one day and I give you free food, you're going to say, great, that's wonderful. Yeah, I'm more engaged. And then I'm going to show up the next week and I'm going to say, what else you got? And I'll say, free food. Now you're going to get a $1,000 credit that you can spend on anything that you want every year. You're going to say, great, yay, I'm more engaged. Then you're going to show up the next week and you're going to say, okay, I got free food. I got this $1,000 credit I could spend on whatever I want. Now what are you going to give me? Now we're going to build a gym and fitness center for you. Great. Then I'm going to show up the next week. And you can kind of see where this is going. And so what ends up happening is you create a corporate culture not because of value that employees are contributing, not because of things that they're learning, not because of the ways that they're learning or growing or developing, but because of these things that they're extracting from you. And so what happens in that kind of a situation is you as an organization, you are focusing on completely the wrong things, right? You are, your employees are not staying with you for the right reasons. You want employees to stay with you because they are treated well, because they are learning and growing and developing, because they're coaching, being coached and mentored, because they're becoming better versions of themselves. And so, there needs to be a balance here, right? We don't want to go to the point where, employees aren't treated well and you say, the hell with you, you're here for a job, just do what I tell you to do and blah, blah, blah. But we also don't want to go to the other extreme where we have Pinocchio's Island. And the challenge now is that we've gone so much to that other extreme that kind of pulling back is hard. We see this when we talk about employees coming into the office. It's completely bonkers to me that organizations are giving employees the power to say that, you're going to pay for my salary, you're going to pay for my benefits, yes, I'm going to have equity in the company, yes, you're going to give me all these wonderful perks, and by the way, I'm not going to go show up into work, screw you. That to me is insane. That leaders are not strong enough to take a stance and say, hey, you know what? That's great that you feel that way. That's not what this company is about. You're more than welcome to go look for another job where you never need to show up to the office. That's on you. But in this organization, here's how we're doing things. And it doesn't mean to say that you need to be in the office full time, 9 to 5. I'm a big believer of flexible work. But flexible work is exactly that. It means you are flexible, meaning that there are going to be some times when you need to show up to work. There are going to be some times where it's okay if you work from home, for example, if you're in back-to-back meetings. But for employees to just say, I'm not going to show up to work, I'm just going to be virtual full time, is crazy. Leaders need to take a stance. They need to put on their big boy and big girl pants and let employees know what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in the organization. You are paying these people money. You're paying them for their benefits, their pension, all these different programs. You are paying for them, not the other way around. So it's time to take a stance and to let employees know what's going on. And I think we're going to see rebalancing of this in the coming years as employees. And part of it, honestly, is I think a lot of tech companies screwed this up. Before Silicon Valley, before the Googles, the Metas, before all these different companies in the Bay Area were doing this, you didn't really hear much of this going on. Right? It was very, maybe a couple of companies on the fringes here and there. All of a sudden, these tech companies come in there and they start, these perks and benefits and blah, blah, blah. And by the way, these companies also have the lowest retention. So how does that make any sense? Well,
because they're all fighting for who can provide the better workout room or the better snacks in the break room, or whatever it is. I think if you look at what we ought to be providing as leaders is an opportunity to advance a clear, purposeful mission, agency to do that, and an opportunity to grow, right? And so if we do that, then that's what we ought to be competing on, rather than these other sort of perks that become entitlements. None of those things are at risk of becoming entitlements. All these other things, I had a conversation with somebody the other day, and they had awarded all of their team birthday off, right? Whenever it's your birthday, you get a free day off. And by the way, whenever the market's closed, we're going to be closed. And they just announced it, and I pointed it out to them. I said, that quickly goes from gratitude to expectation to entitlement over a period of time.
Over about that afternoon, actually.
Yeah.
And the spark of that announcement fades pretty quickly.
So it becomes an entitlement. You still have to spend the money for very little utility and uptick. So I wanted to move from this. I wanted to talk to you about, you wrote a book recently about leadership and vulnerability, and I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Good transition, as I'm talking about all these difficult things that leaders need to do. Now we're talking about vulnerability. So the concept of the book is probably a little bit counterintuitive to what a lot of people are thinking. I always tell leaders, don't be vulnerable at work. Vulnerability is about exposing a gap that you have, a gap in competence, a gap in experience, a gap in wisdom, a gap in whatever it might be. Leading with vulnerability is about exposing a gap that you have and then demonstrating what you're trying to do to close the gap. It's about being accountable and responsible. So, very typical example, you make a mistake on a project. Being vulnerable is saying, I'm really sorry I screwed up. Leading with vulnerability is saying, I'm really sorry I screwed up. Here's what I learned from the mistake. Here are 3 things that I'm going to do going forward to make sure that mistake never happens again. The big challenge now is we've created an environment where we over-index and overemphasize the vulnerability. And as a result, we're using that as a way to justify poor performance. So, you might show up to work. I'm so sorry I made a mistake. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Like, you're okay. Oh, I'm having a tough time. Oh, you're having a tough time. Let me take care of this and blah, blah, blah. It's too much. It's too much over-indexed on that side, right? It's okay to make a mistake. How are you going to fix it? You're going through a tough time? Well, tell me, what are some things that you're working on personally to try to get out of that tough time, right? You need help? Great. I'm happy to help you. But in the future, what are you going to do to help yourself? What are you as an employee going to do to be accountable and responsible? It just feels like we've created this environment where employees show up to work with their hands out and they're like, help anybody. And it's just not the kind of a culture that we want. And it's not all employees, but we're starting to see this more and more and more, especially with the younger generation, with some of these things that are trending on social media, these disturbing, TikTok videos and these disturbing trends on like the Sunday scaries, the Monday morning blues, lazy girl jobs, Sunday scaries. I said, it's just this like crazy stuff of like, we're creating an environment where we are scared to say that hard work is a good thing. It's becoming a bad word in a lot of organizations, and it really drives me nuts. And maybe this is just me, and people are going to look at this and watch this and say, "No, you don't know what you're talking about." Maybe it's because I was raised, by Georgian immigrant parents. But the idea, work is a privilege, right? I mean, everybody should be given the right to apply for a job, right? To try to get the job. But once you get the job, it's a privilege for you to have it. There are lots of other people who are fighting and who would be more than happy to take that job away from you. And we just created this corporate culture where we assume that everybody feels like the job that they have, once they get it, it's my right to be here.
Yeah. I can be disappointed that I have to work 60 hours a week, or I can be very thankful that those 60 hours a week are in an air-conditioned building and not outside using, power tools or something.
It's totally crazy, the things that people are whining and complaining about today. And again, part of it comes down to, Mike Rowe did a recent interview, or maybe it was last year, where he called it the snowflake generation, where the way that we, have parented our kids, it kind of stems from that. But what I'm seeing is it's now making its way into organizations, and companies are becoming these new types of parents that are coddling their employees, that are taking care of them, and come and go when you want. Like, it's okay. You know, we'll push back that project if you're not able to make your deadline. You know, go see so-and-so if you're having a hard time. Like, it's crazy to me. And again, there does need to be a balance. But I think the balance should start from, what are the things that we can do to make you the best professional version of yourself? And that starts with the coaching, the mentoring, the ability to work on difficult challenges and problems, the ability to be able to grow in a company and learn new things, the ability to, get more salary, to have equity in the, right? Those things matter and should be prioritized over, I'm having a tough time, I need to show up to work and I need to go talk to a mental health expert for an hour. And again, once you get that work stuff done, maybe you could sprinkle in some of those other things in there, especially during the pandemic. It became very hard for a lot of people to go see mental health professionals. But if we overblow this mental health stuff, we focus too much on that and not enough on why employees are fundamentally at our companies to begin with, I think we're going to have a problem.
I don't think it's just you, Jacob.
I hope not.
This seems to very much be a trend to move toward where I think a lot of us can observe it, and some people observe it and think it's a good trend. I mean, they notice what you're noticing, but they just disagree with you on the severity of the diagnosis. I think that it's speaking to something that's bigger underlying our culture. As we move into a post-Christian world in the West, we're losing our focus on what our meaning is with our lives and with life in general. And because we're losing that focus on meaning for our own life, companies end up having no meaning. And if my company has no meaning and life in general has no meaning, then my life has no meaning. And eventually we're at a nihilistic worldview, which means, why should I work hard? Working hard is absolutely useless within the confines of nihilism. So I think that's the danger of our increasingly secular world, is that we have lost that meaning. When I work with my clients, we're not working on their companies so much. We're working on the vision of their life. They own a company, but I kind of show them the parallel. Like, you wouldn't ever have a business with no ultimate purpose. You know why your business exists, and that business exists for some reason that's more meaningful than creating a paycheck for yourself, because you could have just gone to work for somebody else, but you started this for something. Well, your life has to have that ultimate purpose and ultimate aim too. But when we tear that down, ultimately we get nothing, and then we lose all of the positive outcomes of a religious framework, of hard work, and of delayed gratification. And I think the real risk is that we don't recognize that that's why we're losing them. So they're dissipating, the hard work ethos dissipates, and we're left with the consequences of a lazy culture. We're left with the consequences of a lack of accountability. We're left with the consequences of a lack of meaning, and we have no idea why.
Yeah, there were some recent studies that came out that said American values were in decline, and they were all in decline. Patriotism, faith, community, family, hard work was in decline as well, although not as much as the others. Meanwhile, things like money were skyrocketing. So yeah, I mean, we see this in a lot of the data that is represented out there as well. But again, I think there are certainly a lot of people who do want to work hard, and a lot of people who are happy to make those sacrifices. I think the challenge is we're not doing a good enough job of prioritizing those people. If you have an organization and you have employees who are willing to wake up early every morning, who are willing to get dressed, who are willing to make that commute, to spend time with you as a leader in the office, to get coached and mentored from you, they are willing to make those sacrifices, you need to be putting a spotlight on those employees. Those are the ones who are willing to go above and beyond. Those are the ones who should see potential, for future leadership, right? And so this is, it's important for leaders to identify these types of people who are willing to go above and beyond. And B, it's also a unique opportunity for you as an employee to go above and beyond when your peers are not willing to. So if you're part of a company and your employees are saying, hey, I'm not going to go past my, 32 hours or 40 hours. I'm not going to show up into the office. I'm not going to take on those difficult projects. I'm just going to point out problems and not come up with solutions. You should be thrilled because now you could say, hey, you know what? I'm going to do the exact opposite of what that person's doing. You want to show up and you want to stay home? I'll show up into the office. You don't want to work 40 hours? I'm going to work 45. You're going to point out all the problems and all the things that are wrong with this company. I'm going to come up with the solutions. You have a very, very unique opportunity as an employee inside of an organization to spend more time with your leaders than ever before. And so we talked about this idea of engagement and leading with vulnerability earlier. Leading with vulnerability is a great way to create that engagement because what it does is it focuses on the two most important aspects of leadership, competence and connection. You need both of those things. And vulnerability is what creates the connection with your people. Vulnerability is being okay to talk about your mistakes and challenges and failures and struggles, but also adding the leadership piece to those. What did you learn? How did you overcome? What are you going to do going forward? And when you create that bond and that relationship between employees and leaders, that's a big part of what employees want. Gallup, even they identified and they said that one of the number one factors that contributes to an employee's engagement is having a best friend at work. Well, how do you want me to have a best friend at work if A, nobody's showing up to work, and B, when I do show up to work, I have to be constantly worried about what I'm saying. People are complaining about me. I'm microaggressions, political correctness. Like, how am I going to have a friend at work when I can't even speak up and I can't share the things that I believe in? Right? You can't have open and honest debates anymore. People are so quick to criticize you and come after you with pitchforks and they burn you at the stake. It's like, what happened? I remember when I was younger, I was not like that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with creating the right culture. There's a quote from video that Nick Saban put out years ago. He was talking about that they are a high achieving organization, and that people who are higher achievers don't like the low, the mediocre low achievers, and vice versa. And he was totally okay with that. So how do you strike the right balance though? Because I think there's a real risk that if you're talking about being vulnerable to create connection, that if there is too much vulnerability, that can be seen as weakness. And I understand, and I hear what you're saying about you be vulnerable, but you've got to come with a solution as well. Are you seeing that in different cultures, that vulnerability is treated differently? In other words, in the United States, is vulnerability treated one way? In South America, is it treated a different way?
We surveyed 14,000 employees, and we saw pretty consistent results. We didn't get so granular as to how is breaking it down to that level. But what we did see is consistency around the world as far as the value of vulnerability, as far as people acknowledging that it's important, and as far as people acknowledging that it's not being practiced in their respective areas. I'd have to go back and look at the data to see if we looked at per country, where is it, which countries are most vulnerable versus less, and this and that, which I can't remember off the top of my head. But we saw very consistent results in terms of men versus women and in terms of geography when aggregated around the power of vulnerability, the need for vulnerability, and also the lack of vulnerability that exists.
What differences did you see between men and women?
None. Very, very slight differences. Nothing significant to the point of like saying that there's an actual difference. We looked at different variables and attributes as far as what people identify as being vulnerable, and there were some slight differences there as far as 2-3 percentage points on various attributes. But I don't even remember off the top of my head what those were.
Were there certain areas where vulnerability had a higher ROI, for lack of a better word, or more utility than other areas? In other words, is it just being vulnerable about my failures, my mistakes, my concerns, or is it vulnerable in certain other areas?
Vulnerability is just about exposing those gaps that you have, right? And it could be those gaps in any area. The talking about the mistakes and failures and blah, 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 that's, one example. Talking about uncertainty could be another example. Being able to take praise from somebody is a sign of vulnerability. Being able to just listen to somebody without interrupting them, without sharing your perspective, can be a sign of vulnerability. So there are a lot of different factors, in the book I talk about these 10 10 signs of vulnerability. But, the whole important point of the book is to say that there is a right way and a wrong way to approach being vulnerable at work. The wrong way is to just talk about the gaps that you have. Now, it's good to have that level of psychological safety where you feel like you can show up to work to talk about those gaps. But the right way to actually approach it is to talk about the gap and what you're trying to do to close it, regardless of what that gap is, regardless if it's a mistake that you made, regardless if you're addressing your employees as a first-time leader and the message that you deliver. There is a right way and there is a wrong way to approach it. And when we looked at the data, what we saw is that the more senior you get inside of an organization, the less likely you are to show a willingness to be emotionally vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense to me.
When you go from mid to senior level leadership, it drops off a cliff completely, which is unfortunate. And we also found that the number one reason that people do not want to show any kind of vulnerability at work is because they don't want to be perceived as being weak or incompetent. And so the solution to that is you demonstrate competence with the vulnerability. And there's a concept in psychology called the pratfall effect, which basically states that there's this very strong relationship between vulnerability and competence. And what that means is that if you are highly competent, you're good at your job, and then you display vulnerability, you are viewed as being more likable. You are being viewed as more capable. You get a little bit of a 1 + 1 = 3 effect. And that's because you've already demonstrated your competence, and now the vulnerability makes you seem more human. And now somebody looks at you and they say, oh, wow, so-and-so, they're really good at their job. Wow, they're also like a human being now. I like that. So you get a little bit of a boost. But the flip side of that is also true. If you are not good at your job and you're demonstrating vulnerability and you're constantly showing up to work talking about the gaps that you have, the mistakes that you made, the challenges, tough time this, and you're not good at your job, it reinforces your mediocrity.
Yeah.
And so now people are going to look at you and they're going to say, yeah, I get why you're not getting promoted. I get why you're not closing those deals. Right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be good at everything. It means that you need to demonstrate that you're trying to close your gaps, right? So if you're a first-time leader, there's going to be a lot of things that you don't know how to do, but you don't go in front of your employees and say, hey, I'm a first-time leader. I'm really nervous, but I know we're going to have some amazing things happen. Yay, go team. That doesn't really inspire much confidence. Instead, you go in front of your employees as a first-time leader and you say, hey, you could start with the vulnerability. Hey, I'm a first-time leader. I'm a little nervous. I've never done this before, but here's what I'm going to do to make sure that I'm the best leader that you've ever had. Here's some books that I'm reading. I'm working with an executive coach. One of the leaders at this company is going to be meeting with me once every week or once every month to be reviewing my leadership style. My door is always going to be open for you for feedback. So I'm acknowledging I've never done this before, but I'm also demonstrating to you what I'm trying to do to close that gap to make sure that I can be amazing at whatever it is that I'm doing. So it doesn't mean you actually need to be amazing at it, but at least demonstrate that you're trying to get there. You are learning, you are growing and trying to become a better version.
Yeah, a lot of people end up sharing the gap and using it as, hey, this is an innate character trait that I possess that I cannot rid myself of. I'm just not good at Excel. Well, you're a quant analyst, so you got to be good at Excel, dude.
Hurry up,
you better learn it. This is just my little quirk. And when they do that, that's frustrating for coworkers. It's frustrating even more so when that person is in a leadership authority over us, because it's like, oh my gosh, my leader's coming and telling me he stinks at this thing. Guess who's got to pick it up? Me. And now I got to pick up the slack. He's not doing anything about it. And whenever I have a gap, he's not going to react that way. He's not going to say, oh, well, you're just bad at that element of your job, because
you don't get that grace.
I don't get the grace and I don't have anybody to boot it over to. So it makes so much sense to me when you say, Jacob, hey, we've got to acknowledge as a leader, hey, this is my shortcoming, but this is where I'm improving. When have you seen someone do that really, really well?
Yeah. And by the way, just to add on to your point really quick, no leader, if you go to your leader and talk about a failure or a mistake or whatever, no leader is going to look at you and say, okay, thank you for telling me. On the inside, the leader is still going to be wondering like, okay, but the problem is still there. The customer is still unhappy. The goal still hasn't been met. The revenue numbers have still not been achieved. We're still behind schedule. So your leader is not going to just assume that, okay, you came forward with that thanks, you get a pass, go on your merry way and I'll take care of it. Your leader's going to look at you and say, okay, and? Thank you for telling me, and? What are you doing about it? And that's the challenge that we see. We are not adding that action piece to it, which I think we need to do a much better job of. So, there are two stories that I talk about in the book. There's lots of stories, but I open the book with two stories. One from Hollis Harris, the former CEO of Continental Airlines, and one from the CEO of a company called Sassel. In Hollis Harris, in the late 80s, early 90s, a company was going through a tough time, and his board asked him to send out a memo to his workforce. So he sends out a memo to the almost 40,000 employees, and he talks about the challenges that the business is going through, the tough, turbulent economic times. And he ends his memo by telling his employees that the best thing they could do is to pray for the future of the company. Very vulnerable thing to say.
That's a deathbed statement.
Yep. The next day he gets fired. So vulnerability for a leader is not the same as it is for a non-leader, because you have a unique position. I also interviewed the CEO of American Airlines. He told me there would be many times where he would sit alone in his car during the pandemic, pumping himself up and getting himself excited and optimistic before he would show up to work, because he knew that all of his employees were watching and reading the news talking about how American Airlines was going bankrupt. And in those times and in those situations, he couldn't show up to work being vulnerable and talking about, I don't know, maybe the company's going to disappear. Maybe you won't have a job. He would show up to work saying, you know what, we're going to be fine. He could not show that vulnerability in those times. Now, Fleetwood Grobler, as I mentioned, the former CEO of Sassel, when he took over, the company was $13 billion in debt. The banks were about to come in and repossess the business. He also had to give a town hall meeting to his employees, and his message was very different. Now, he started off with vulnerability, talking about the challenges, that the company was in debt, that he didn't know how they were going to get out of this mess. And then he added the leadership and said, I have a vision for where this business can go. And I know that we can turn things around and rebuild trust in the eyes of our employees and in our customers. And if you come with me on this journey and help me figure out that path forward, I know that we can turn this business around and become successful. So he was vulnerable, but he added the leadership piece in there. So it's okay when there is vulnerability, but ask yourself, how can I add leadership to it? And one of the big mistakes that leaders make is they forget to ask themselves, why do I need a vulnerability? What's the intention behind it? So it's not just about talking for the sake of talking. It's not about treating your organization like a group therapy session. You have to ask yourself, okay, if there is something, so vulnerability, you can think about it, define it as doing or saying something that exposes you to the potential of emotional harm. Meaning you say or do something where somebody else could take that information and potentially use it to harm you if they wanted to. So if you talk about, I've never done this before, somebody could take that information and say, hey, why is Jacob on this team? He just told me he's never done this before. Remove him. So, example. So the idea of exposing yourself to the potential of emotional harm is really how a lot of us can think of vulnerability. And it's okay to do that. But again, add in that leadership piece, add in the competence piece. It's the exposure to the potential of emotional harm that creates trust. That's why employees will trust you, because you are willing to share or do certain things. One of the researchers that I interviewed is Dr. Sim Sitkin. And he said that in academic literature, there are 22 different definitions of trust, and every single one of them have to do with vulnerability. In other words, you cannot create vulnerability, or you cannot create trust without vulnerability. Vulnerability is also how you become a better version of you. It's about acknowledging a gap, acknowledging that you can get better and learn and grow and improve. And the leadership piece is actually how you improve. So the gap, and then how I'm closing the gap. This is not just in the best interest of your team, it's in the best interest for you and your career, for your self-preservation, to become a better leader, to become a better employee, and to learn and to grow.
What would you say is, just final question, what would you say is your top decision-making tip for business owners?
Top decision-making tip. I'm a big fan of paying attention to the signs. And I'm not talking about signs in like, M. Night Shyamalan kind of like weird signs, movie kind of way. I mean, being more intuitive and paying attention to what the market is telling you, what your peers are telling you, what you're seeing. So what I mean by that is, take, for example, we can use my industry or, speaking or content or marketing. If you do something and you see that you're not getting feedback that you're moving in the right direction, you should pay attention to that. If you are doing something and you see that you are getting feedback, you are getting interactions, people are reading it, people are commenting, you are getting good feedback, that's a sign you should be moving in that direction. And I think too often we do things, we make investments in things, and we assume that that's the only path that we can take.
Yeah.
And we don't pay attention to the signs around us, right? And sometimes they're not going to be explicit signs. It's not like somebody's going to come to you and say, hey, you're really bad at that, you should stop. But, you create a business and you see that you're not attracting the clients that you should be. That's a sign that you pay attention to. You start speaking and you see that you're not getting asked to speak at more events. That's a sign you should be paying attention to. You create a piece of content, you put it up online. People are not responding to it. That's a sign that you should be paying attention to. So I think the best thing that you can do to make good decisions is to just pay attention to the signs. Sometimes they're qualitative, sometimes they're quantitative, sometimes there's data behind it. And I think another really good, it's not necessarily decision-making, but it's a piece of advice, is to learn to be agile. Learn to pivot, learn to create new opportunities, learn to look at the skills that you have and how you can apply those skills to different areas, not just to one. And I think those are probably pretty helpful pieces of advice for decision-making. And surround yourself by people who will give you different perspectives than the one that you have.
Thanks for being here, Jacob. The book, Leading with Vulnerability, it's great. Where can people connect with you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So there are a couple places. Obviously the book, which I love that you have there. That's super cool. I didn't know you guys were going to do that. So people can go to, I believe it's leadwithvulnerability.com. We made a special URL for that. I'm just going to confirm it. Yes, leadwithvulnerability.com for the book. It's also on Amazon, wherever else you want to grab a book. I have a Substack where I share some of the research and insights. That's greatleadership.substack.com. And then my personal website is thefutureorganization.com. That's where people can connect with me, and my email is on there. And then we actually just put out a PDF people might be interested in. If you're interested in leadership, if you go to topleadershiptrends.com, I chronicle and write about the top leadership trends for 2024.
Thank you so much, Jacob.
Thanks a lot, Jacob.
Thank you for having me.
My takeaway from talking with Jacob is when you're looking at vulnerability, that there is an appropriateness to sharing sort of your concerns or what you see as a failing perhaps, but that it is critical to pair that statement of vulnerability with solutions and actions and leadership. You can't just be vulnerable. That will result in a viewpoint of weakness, but you've got to pair that with solutions and leadership.
That was my biggest takeaway well, was saying, here's what I'm going to do to solve that. It sounds so simple, but I imagine that in practice, it's way more difficult. Not that it's more complex, but actually doing that's where all the magic is. And that's the linchpin upon which your entire credibility as a leader is hinging.
You just made a great decision to listen to this episode of Decidedly. Make another great decision by subscribing to the show and leaving us a 5-star review wherever you're listening. We appreciate the support. It helps business owners like you find our community and defeat bad decision-making in their own lives. For more decision-making insights, check us out at decidedlypodcast.com, on Instagram at decidedlypodcast, or grab a copy of Sanger and Sean's books from the links in the show notes. Finally, we'd like to thank Shelby Peterson of Transcend Media for editing and post-production of the show. Thanks for listening. I'm Morgan, your producer, and this is Decidedly.